The church of God is in dire straits. We don't really know the half of it. The truth is that Christians are in prison right now in various parts of the world. They have been, within the past several months, sold on auction blocks in the Sudan. They are persecuted, they are scattered, they are treated as the offscourings of the earth. People who proclaim the name of Christ with whatever level of understanding they've got, with whatever minimal grasp of the truth they have got, whatever attempt they make to obey the carpenter of Nazareth that they find themselves oftentimes nowadays hated, scattered, persecuted, mistreated, and so forth in the world. We, in our generation of the church, in our little corner of the church, understand about churches being scattered and pushed around and mistreated and what have you. But candidly, on a historical scale, we don't know the half of it. We don't even know the beginnings. And I'm asked sometimes by people, as a matter of concern with them, what do you think about the church now? And what do you think about the church in the future? And where do you think the church of God is going? Well, I don't know how anyone could possibly really say that or foretell that, or without some divine revelation from God give you a thus saith the Lord, this is where the church is going. And I've heard opinions are cheap. You know, they're out there by the dime a dozen, and all kinds of people. I mean, if you've got to ask 40 people about where's the church going or what's happening in the church, you probably get 40 different opinions from all those people about what's going on. God scatters the church, Satan scatters the church. Take your pick of whatever particular version of it might be out there. But it occurs to me that maybe one of the reasons we don't understand is what is happening to the church is because we're attempting to look forward into the future where there is nothing yet, because the future is built by the decisions that we and God are making day by day. Since we can't look into the future very well, maybe we ought to look at the past. Maybe we ought to go back a ways and think in terms of where this stuff got started, and is there any word of prophecy that would have to do with the church of God? Well, it just so happens that there is, and it's found in the beginning of the book of Revelation. Revelation is a curious book in a lot of ways, and people always find it the book that nobody understands, and yet, if you approach Revelation soberly and carefully and without a lot of complicated preconceived ideas, there is an enormous amount of truth, moral teaching, understanding to be grasped in the book of Revelation. And when you get to the symbols and all of the strange beasts and many-headed this and that, well, you can leave those on the shelf for the time being, because the wealth of Revelation does not lie there. The wealth of it lies in the purpose of it. It is called in chapter 1, verse 1, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show his servants things which must shortly come to pass. And he sent and he signified it by an angel to his servant John. Now, probably the most important thing you can grasp about the book of Revelation is that it was given by Jesus Christ to show his servants things which must shortly come to pass. In fact, much of what you read in the book of Revelation was to be fulfilled within the lifetime of John, or certainly within the lifetime of the people who heard John say these words. Now, don't misunderstand me. There is a complete and full purpose for Revelation for the end time. But Isaiah made this curious statement back in the 41st chapter of Isaiah. He said, produce your cause, bring forth your strong reasons. Show us what happened in the past so we can consider it and understand the latter end thereof. So the first thing for you to understand about Revelation is that it was given to show his servants in the first century, probably sometime in the late 60s A.D., what was going to be coming to pass in the very near future in their lifetime, and that what was going to happen there would be a type of what was going to happen at the time of the very end. If you try to approach the book of Revelation as being solely about the end time, without any reference to the history, without any reference to the first round, as it were, of fulfillments of Revelation, you will miss the point almost entirely. Because you'll be trying to hang your interpretations, you'll set them up here for people to look at, and you'll have no hooks to hang them on. And they'll be either float in midair with no support or they'll fall to the ground, which things usually do when they don't have any hooks to be hung on. So to understand the book of Revelation and to understand the history of the church, you've got to go back here and you've got to consider the fact that this was given to show His servants what's happening now and where it's going to lead shortly, so that they would look at it and say, okay, now they presumed that the return of Christ would then be shortly. Unfortunately, that was not the case. The return of Christ was well out into the future. But the initial message of the book of Revelation was for those people living then, so they could be prepared for what was soon to come upon them. So, if we will just approach it with this in mind, realizing that the book of Revelation starts out in the past, and there is, in the initial stages of it, it's mostly about the past, and finds its way to the very end time. And in the latter part of it, it's almost entirely about the end time. So that there is this, and there is no break. There's no place where you can say, oh, well, now here's where it makes the switch. Because there's a mystical quality about the book of Revelation. There's an esoteric quality about the book of Revelation. And the harder you try to be specific about this book, the more it is going to tend to escape you. It's like a work of art. You know, you stand back from a work of art and you gaze at it for a while and you draw certain impressions from it. And then when you walk up real close to it and start looking at the brush strokes, and you get out a magnifying glass and look at the individual brush strokes, the painting is lost. The meaning of the painting is lost. The beauty of it is lost. The message, everything goes when you get all the way down to brush strokes and technique. And unfortunately, this is the way people tend to study the Bible, in Revelation in particular. They get out the magnifying glass and they look at carefully the brush strokes. Well, what we're going to talk about a little while today, in order to try to understand the church and the condition the church is in today and what's in store for the church in the years to come, perhaps we can gain some understanding from the book of Revelation in that it looks at the church then and at the time of the end. And if you believe we are quickly approaching the time of the end, you could say it looks at the church then and now. All right, Revelation 1:1, to show His servants things which must shortly come to pass. He sent and signified it by His angel to His servant John, who bare record of the word of God and of the testimony of Jesus Christ and of all the things that he saw. Blessed is he that reads and they that hear the words of this prophecy and keep the things that are written therein, for the time is at hand. Many of the things that are written here were imminent upon those people. Now when he says, blessed is he that reads and he that hears, if you would just visualize this as being similar to a synagogue service, where someone like me will stand before you and will read the words of this epistle, and it is a letter, it's an epistle, to you. Blessed be me for reading it, and blessed be you for hearing it. This is the blessing that John pronounces upon you and I today, down through time. Blessed are we. John, to the 7 churches which are in Asia, grace be unto you and peace from him which is and was and which is to come, and from the 7 spirits which are before his throne. Now, if we just can get this one thing in our mind, we tend to think of the epistles of Paul, the 21 of them. We think of the general epistles, the 7 of them. We oftentimes fail to realize that Revelation is an epistle. It's a letter. It was written specifically to 7 churches. Now, what I want you to understand about these 7 churches is that they existed. That's the first thing to get your mind around. There were 7 real churches on the ground in Asia Minor when he wrote this letter. There are 2 theories about the time he wrote the letter. One of them is very late, like in the 90s. The other, I think more likely, is in the late 60s. Because the implications of the book are that Nero was ruling in Rome at the time that this was written. Anyway, whichever the case, these 7 churches existed. John was on the Isle of Patmos. He was in prison, as it were. He was able to send a letter out, but he was not able to go himself. So there he is on the Isle of Patmos. And he said, speaking of him, he said, he comes with clouds, verse 7, every eye shall see him, and they also that pierced him, and all kindreds of the earth shall wail because of him. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is and was and is to come, the Almighty. I, John, who am your companion and brother in tribulation and the kingdom and patience of our Lord Jesus, was in the Isle of Patmos for the word of God and for the testimony of Jesus Christ. I was in the Spirit in the day of the Lord, carried into the day of the Lord. And I heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet saying, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. What you see, write it in a book, and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, unto Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. This letter was not sent to the church in Charleston. It was not written to the church in Charleston. It was written to these 7 churches. They were there. They really were there. And the things we're going to learn about these 7 churches are all history. All about history. And I'll explain further what I mean by that and the implications of it as I go along. He said, I turned to see the voice that spoke to me, and I turned and I saw 7 golden candlesticks. And in the middle of the 7 candlesticks, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. Now, none of us have any question who this is. This is Christ, the risen, glorified Christ, appearing to him in vision. And there are 7 lampstands, candlesticks they call them. A candle at the time was not a wax candle. It was a lamp on a stand that was fed by olive oil, and it was an olive oil burning lamp. And there were 7 of them. And he stands in the middle of these 7 lamps. What do they mean? What's the symbolism that we're reading here? Well, he said, in the middle of all this was one like the Son of Man. And he said his head and his hairs were white as wool. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet like fine brass, like they burned in the furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters, like a great thundering waterfall. And he had in his right hand 7 stars, and a sharp 2-edged sword. And his countenance was like the sun shines in its full strength. And I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead, and I surely would think so. You have a vision like that, it would drop you to the floor in a minute. And he said, don't be afraid, I am the first and the last. I am he that lives and was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore. Amen. And I have the keys of hell and death. That means I can let them go. The people that are held in the grave by death, I got the key. I can let them out. He goes on to say, write the things which you have seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Now that is interesting, because the implication of this is, I want you to write down history, current events, and what's coming in the future. So there are 3 elements that are developed in this. And unfortunately for us, there is no line drawing anywhere in the book. And I think one of the reasons there isn't any is because there is a continuum, there's a connection between the history and the present and the future at any given point in time. You've all heard the expression, history repeats itself. There's a truism in that, and the truism is that men tend to make the same mistakes over and over again. And God reacts to the sins of man the same way over and over again. And so these patterns keep rolling around in the same old tired cycles down through history. And so that history does repeat itself. Write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. The mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which you saw are the 7 churches. Now, there are some profound things to consider about this little statement here. There is a spirit world that exists in parallel with our own. We don't see it. We don't experience it most of the time. Very rare for anybody to ever experience it, but it's there. Churches have angels. Nations have angels. Shucks. Children have angels. That spirit world is out there, and these angelic beings have their influence on that part of God's creation where they find themselves responsible, or where they find themselves accountable to God, and where they do the things that God requires of them relative to nations, relative to churches, relative to individuals. And so consequently, when we march into this situation, we see 7 churches and 7 angels. There's a lot of implications in this that I don't think people have considered, and one of the reasons we haven't really considered it adequately is because of a tendency that we have had in the past to think of the church in monolithic terms. Now, this is a curious thing, but throughout Christianity, in whatever particular brand of it you may have had some association with, there is a belief in the one true church. And even among those churches that are, let's say, autonomous and self-determining, each one of them, they nevertheless believe that their denomination, their either close denomination or their extended denomination, is at some degree the one true church, and the others are really not quite right. There are Protestant denominations. I bet you we wouldn't have to drive 10 miles to get to one of them, right here, who believe that their denomination is the one and only true church, and if you're not a member of that denomination, you're going to hell on the day you die. Just because you're a Baptist and a good one, it's not good enough. You will go to hell, and you will go immediately. You will not pass go, and you will not collect $200, to borrow the old analogy. They believe that. And so and you can attend seminars or workshops with these people, in which one of them, I think, was 7 days travel in search of a church. And what it was an attempt to establish the legitimacy of this particular church denomination as being the one legitimate church of God. So that almost whatever denomination church you go to, there is this little hangover element somewhere of the one true church. And so if we think of ourselves, or if we allow ourselves to think of the church in monolithic terms, as, for example, some of you here I know in time past have been a part of an organization that saw itself as the one true church. And there weren't two churches. There weren't three churches. There was one church. And that's all there is to it. And you were either a part of that church or you were not connected with God. And if you were cut off from that church, you were cut off from God. So that the church is perceived as one. Now, when you have this doctrine so well established, to the point that if you disfellowship a person, they are desperate to get back in the church because that church is their key to the kingdom. It's their route to the kingdom. It's the gateway. And if they can't be a part of the church, they're not even going to be in the kingdom. When you have come to that particular point in time, you are going to approach the letters in these churches that we see here very differently. For example, one of the primary solutions to the problem that these 7 churches is that they are 7 successive church eras of one true church. Because God will only work with one church at a time. And He will work with this church over a period of time. When that period of time is over with, that church fades into obscurity, a new church comes on the scene. And He works with that one. But at all times, there is only one church with whom God works. The church eras is probably about the only way you can really approach this if you believe in the monolithic church. The problem with it is, it does not take history into account. And I'm here to tell you, folks, that if you don't take history into account when you tackle prophecy to try to understand prophecy, you will fail. You will fail. You will misunderstand it. You will go down blind alleys. You will develop a scenario of prophecy that turns out to be completely wrong. Because prophecy was not meant to be understood in midair. It has roots. It goes back into history. It actually has foundations that you can go back and study, and you can realize that what we're looking at now grew out of something distinct that was in the past. Now, the reason I'm taking all this time with this and beating this into the ground, as it were, is that we all need to understand that this letter that was not written to one church. It was written to 7 churches. Why? That's one question I think is worth us knowing. And what is there about this that we can understand as we come down to this? Now, I think the fact that there were 7. Notice, he held in his hand 7 angels. Why 7? Well, because there were 7 churches. Well, we haven't solved our problem, have we? Why 7 churches? The answer is that 7 is universally understood to be the Bible number of what? Whole, completion, all. In other words, the fact that there were 7 angels and 7 churches meant what I'm talking about in this passage of Scripture is all of them. But all of them when? Well, let's examine the churches and see if we can kind of grasp a little bit about this and how it might speak to us in the end time. Unto the angel of the church at Ephesus write, Revelation 2, verse 1. These things saith he that holds the 7 stars in his right hand. Not 8, not 6, 7 stars in his right hand. Who walks in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. What's really fascinating about this is that it is in telling us that there are 7, he tells us it represents all of it, but he tells us all of it is not one. You understand this distinction? That if you want to talk about something that is one, you talk about it in terms of one. One angel, one star, one candlestick, right? But in fact, by the mere choice of 7, you say that the whole is composed of parts. Oddly enough, not even necessarily 7 parts. It just tells you it's composed of parts. Because the entirety of the church, when John wrote this letter, would have been comprised of what? 100? 200 churches? We know that they were all over the landscape in the Middle East at this time. There were churches, in Rome. There were probably 7 of them at the time Paul finally wrote the book of Romans. Probably 7 churches that existed sprinkled around the landscape of the city of Rome alone. We know that there were thousands of Christians in Jerusalem, and they can't possibly have all attended church at the same time, and they couldn't have all heard the sermon. They met, I'm sure, in church synagogues, as it were, all around Jerusalem during those years. And so the churches were scattered far and wide. There were hundreds of them. Why these 7? Well, because what we are trying to do here is to make prophecy. We are ultimately trying to look at the distant future while we are looking at the near future. We are using the near future as a model, as a pattern, as a type for the distant future. To the church of angel, he tells him, "This thus saith he that walks in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. I know your works and your labor and your patience." Mind you, this letter is written not to the church. It's written to the angel of the church, which in itself is fascinating. And why it would have been written this way is a little bit hard to say. But it was. It is worded, however, as you read it, as though it is written to the individual members of the congregation. "I know your works, your labor, your patience, and how you cannot bear those who are evil, and how you have tried those that say they are apostles and are not, and have found them liars. And you have borne, and you have had patience, and for my name's sake you have worked, and you haven't given up." That's really all admirable. I do have something against you, because you have left your first love. Now, that is a fascinating accusation to lay upon any church. What does he mean, I wonder? You have left your first love. Perhaps the answer is repent and do the first works. In other words, those works that inspired you in the earlier years, those works that you drove yourself onward and upward to do during those years. He said, for example, "I know your works and your labor and your patience and all these things that you have done, but you're drifting. You're beginning to lose the grip, folks. I'm concerned about what's going on here." Then he says something truly astonishing. He said, "Repent and do the first works, or else I will come unto you quickly, and I will remove your candlestick out of its place." What that suggests is that it is entirely possible for a church, a given church, to cease to be the church of God. Their candlestick just gets grabbed and jerked out of its place. It's no more. The angel, I don't know what becomes of him. I guess he goes up and gets latrine duty or what have you in heaven, or KP, as it were. But he has failed. He has not done his job. This you have, that you hate the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which also I hate. And what that is not entirely relevant to us. When you look through the Bible, you will find absolutely nothing to tell you anything about the Nicolaitans. And when you study history and look in the commentaries, you will find no real agreement on who the Nicolaitans were. I would have to conclude, based upon what little I've been able to learn about them, that who they were is not important. What is important is that there were a group of people called the Nicolaitans who had a certain pattern of deeds in their life that the Ephesian church hated, and that God hated. These people were, in very real sense, they hated what God hated, and they loved what God loved. He that has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him that overcomes will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. Now, what you should know about this letter is that without much question, it was taken from church to church to church and read everywhere. There was all 7 of these churches heard all 7 of these letters that were written, because he said, "He that has an ear to hear," and you reach up and grab your ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches, which means he expected one church to hear the warnings that were given to all the rest. Now that makes a lot of sense, and it's pretty easy to understand if you understand that the church in Ephesus was a real church. There were real people there. They were people just like you folks here. They had a distribution of ages among them. There were men, women, and children. There were old people and young people. There were people who were infirm. There were people who were sick. There were people who had to keep a foot propped up on a pillow somewhere because they'd hurt themselves. That same kind of pattern of churches would have existed. Just like you. Real people. And that's what he is describing here. It was those people who left their first love, and it was those people who were in danger of having their candlestick plucked out by the roots because they had left their first love. Nothing more than that. Apathy, just simple apathy, is enough to get you jerked out of the socket. that bother you? You know, I look around at the church today, and if I were looking for a dominant characteristic of our church in the 20th century, really, I don't know if I'd even limit it to our church. Because I see it across the nation, our nation today, just everywhere I turn. I see apathy, voter apathy, Christian apathy. And here we are in the Church of God, and I look around at us, and I see how hard it seems to be for people to stir themselves up. I remember a time when people would drive 100 miles to go to church and think nothing of it. And they did it every week. And they'd go there and they would sit and they would listen to a sermon that lasted 3 hours and were glad to hear it. And they'd go back home because they never had any contact with Christians at any other time. They were desperate for the fellowship. They were desperate for the instruction. They didn't have the incredible availability of videotapes and audio tapes and printed material. They didn't have this incredible volume of edifying material that you folks have got today. They didn't have the connections with one another to be able to talk on the phone halfway across the country for a dime a minute. They didn't have the ability to stay in touch like we do. And so they worked hard at the things of learning and understanding. They studied hard the correspondence course. They studied their Bibles day in and day out. They wanted desperately to learn more about God. And it seems that the more readily things become available for us, the easier it is to study our Bible. The easier it is to be fed by cassette tape, videotape, printed material, the internet, and what have you. The easier it is to get in touch with other Christians by phone and be able to have that kind of fellowship. The less we pursue it, and the less we seem to want it. Now, I'm not telling you that this is true to tell you that you are worse than any other human being. There is a fundamental character flaw, or something built into the characteristic. I won't call it a flaw because God made us all. There's something built into us that tends to respond that way. I used to really enjoy billiards. A friend of mine and I, we'd take off for lunch and we'd go have a cheeseburger and Coke, and we'd shoot pool through our lunch hour and go back to work. Looked forward to it, anxious to do it, missed it when we couldn't do it, had a wonderful time at it. Some years later, at one of my homes, I had a pool table of my own. And I would go back to my pool table and I would play pool, or I'd have some friends over who would play pool. And I rapidly lost interest in playing pool. And I can't remember the last time I picked up a pool cue and shot a ball across the table. I used to like to play golf until I moved on to a golf course. And could play golf anytime. Had a golf cart sitting there I could use anytime. Could play morning, noon, and night if I could see at night. I could play anytime, whatever I wanted to, and had easy access to it. And I went out and played golf, and I slowed down, and I lost interest, and I never played golf anymore. I don't know exactly what it is about it, that as things become easier for us, they become cheaper. And I suspect somehow in this message to Ephesus here, about having left their first love, there is a warning to people down through generations that there is always this risk that it's going to become easy for you, and you will lose interest in whatever it was that you thought you were doing. I wonder. It will become easy, for example, that you don't really find it necessary to explain your beliefs to your neighbor or to your friends or to your family or the people you work with, because you're part of an organization that's doing a work, and they've got a television program and a magazine and literature out the ears, and you got all this stuff, everything anybody could ever possibly want, and they're taking care of that. So I don't have to worry about that. And so we have lost, in a sense, that first love. And I do remember this, probably in my case, and I expect it was in many of your cases as well, that what was most characteristic of our first love was the desire to share it with somebody else. I got to tell somebody. This is exciting. I've never seen this before. Surely, if I tell him, he'll see it just like I do. It's and I would want to tell everyone about the things that I knew. And somehow, some way, over the process of time, we lost that. I got an advantage on all of you. I got a radio program, so I can get up there and tell them all the time. But I don't really have an advantage, because it is just as easy to tell a friend. It's just as easy to tell your neighbors. It's easy to tell your family. It's just as easy to talk to people you meet as it is to talk on the radio. In fact, probably in some ways it's easier. In some ways it's easier. But in both cases, you do have to prepare. So I read this and I think to myself, I think that the loss of first love that took place in the Ephesian church might be something for us to understand about the church at the end time. Now, I will tell you this. Let me tell you before I go further what I believe about the 7 churches of Asia. I do not believe they represent 7 successive eras in the history of the church. Now, it might make a convenient sermon to be able to use it as an analogy or a model to help people learn about the history of the church if they say, well, the Ephesian era is like this and so forth. But I will say to you, I do not believe that is what Jesus was talking about to John. I do not believe that is the meaning that he intended to convey. I believe the meaning he intended to convey is that these 7 churches and their problems are symbolic of the entire church of God at the end time, of what that church will be like, the problems that church will face, and what it will be dealing with when it comes to the bitter end. The problems that you read about in this place are not necessarily the problems that you will encounter. They are symbols of, types of the problems that you will encounter. And when you make a mistake, when you over-literalize prophecy and try to say, well, there must be going to be 7 church organizations in the end time, and you start ticking off which churches represent which ones of these things that are here. And it's funny how the people who do this inevitably see themselves in their church as guess who? Philadelphia, right? Which by itself ought to give you pause, that is the way we tend to interpret these things. No, I don't think so. I think the number 7 is not to be taken literally. It's to be taken symbolically as meaning the whole. I think that you may find people in these different attitudes and characteristics here in any given church, except for one thing. The truth is that groupthink has always been with us. And that if you are a part of a church, and you're in attendance with a church, and you're regularly with that church, you folks will homogenize. And you will come to a kind of common denominator. And unfortunately, it is often the lowest common denominator. And it is very, very difficult for any one person to be very different from the dominant characteristic of a church. That's something for you to think deeply about in relationship to yourself, where you fellowship, and who you were with. And that if that church is a church that tends to pull you down, and I've heard people say, I felt worse going home from church than I did when I went there. I'll tell you something, if you can't get over that, if you can't overcome that, if you can't scale that mountain, you need to stop going there, because it's pulling you down. Now, I will say this, that if you can overcome it, if you can go home feeling fine and just feeling sorry for the poor people you just left, then maybe you can keep going there. The question is, are you merely disgusted with them, or are they pulling you down? And if they're pulling you down, you better find another solution to your church problem. Because here you'll find illustrated in this book, these churches were not very far apart. You could have probably, if you're good, get up and move, walked from any one of them to the other in a day's time. They sat out on a mail route right around the corner there in Asia Minor. They were not very far apart. I have very little doubt these churches were in regular communication with one another. They were close. Every one of them knew what the others were doing. And yet you have in these 7 churches some truly astonishing differences. Continue with Smyrna in verse 8. To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last who was dead and is alive. I know your works and your tribulation and your poverty. But folks, you are really rich. I know the blasphemy of those that say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Don't be afraid of those things you'll suffer. The devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried. You'll have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. Now, if you're going to go looking for, in the future, a church that will be persecuted and some of its people cast into jail for 10 years or 10 days, I think you are making a mistake. The first thing for you to do is to understand this letter was written to who? The church in Smyrna. Real people alive on the ground at that time. They were a very poor church. Now, the reason why some of these people were in extreme poverty, you normally would think, well, surely there'll be some people who are well-to-do and some people who are not well-to-do and some are poor in a given church. Why does he write to a church and they're all poor? The reason is, folks, because at that time there were economic sanctions against these people in some of these cities. that if you were a Christian and you didn't worship the idol and you didn't go the way of the religion of that town, you couldn't do business there. That old thing about not, the mark of the beast, it was already there in some form at that time. You couldn't buy and you couldn't sell if you're not a part of the religious system of this town. That happened to these people in Smyrna. They were poor. But God says, you're rich. It was hard to say about these people. I know the blasphemy of those that say they are Jews but are not. Now, I have heard more drivel on this topic than many topics that I can think of in the book of Revelation as to what that means in a prophetic sense about those who say they are Jews and are not. What is important, I think, is to realize that what he is talking about is the first century. And unless you can get your mind around what that meant to this church in this place at that time, you are almost certainly going to miss what's going on in the church at the end and misinterpret and misalign whatever this is talking about. Now, there was a Jewish problem in the early church. The Jewish problem in the early church was that the church almost immediately was divided along the lines of those people who believed that Christianity was just another form of Judaism, and those who believed that the break with Judaism was complete. You see this being reflected beginning with the Jerusalem conference, with the conflict when Paul came back and they were all celebrating and breaking the champagne corks and everything else about all the Gentiles who had been converted. And then here comes some party poopers on the scene from Jerusalem, says you can't do that. Because these people have got to follow along the line of circumcision and keeping the law of Moses to be saved, in order to even be in the church and to have be started on the lines to salvation. For us to even be able to sit down and eat with these people. And it wasn't just the law of Moses. It was a lot bigger package than that when it got down to it. It was the entire system of Judaism. They were the Pharisees who believed, and it was the Pharisaical structure of Judaism that they were insisting on for these people, which had to start with circumcision even for adults. And so, the church, right off the bat, faced a challenge from Judaism within the church. And it's easy to understand. It's so easy to understand how this would have been so. As people believed in Jesus, believed He was the Messiah, believed a set of the doctrines, but never gave up the racism and the superiority that it granted to them from their religion, from Judaism of the time, which wouldn't eat with Gentiles, wouldn't sit with them, wouldn't walk in their house, wouldn't have anything to do with a Gentile. And there is not one word about that in the law of Moses. Not one word. And in fact, the law of Moses makes specific provision for Gentiles to worship God on a level par with Jews. Study it. Look it up. Look up the strangers and the aliens that you find in the Old Testament, and you'll find they had to live under the same code that the Jews lived. There was one law for him that was homeborn and for him that was a stranger, even when it came to worshiping God. So this old idea of separation was not theirs. Judaism, as I made a comment earlier this morning, is not the religion of the Old Testament. It is the religion of the Jews. It is the Jewish people's response to the revelation of the Old Testament. And in that response to God, they have developed an incredible cultural structure which is expressed in the Talmud that is the central pillar of Judaism. And so that the problem that existed in the early church, the Jewish problem they had, was with those people who tried to put new wine into old bottles. They tried to take the teachings of Jesus and to marry them up with and merge them with the teachings of Judaism. And any careful reading of the gospel accounts, take your red letter edition out, find the words of Jesus and read them, you will find that Jesus makes it very clear that His teachings are not compatible with the traditions of the fathers. And the tradition of the fathers was that body of oral law which formed the basis of Judaism and which finally found expression in the Talmud. The Jewish problem in the early church was the attempt to turn Christianity into just another sect of Judaism. Now, is that what he's talking about here? I can't be certain, and neither can you. All we know is that there was a Jewish problem in the church at that time, and there were people who claimed to be Jews but who were not. And it's a funny thing about that, and the only comparison that I can draw to it is what I've seen myself nowadays in the church as a people who have kind of lost their bearings. You know, they got plucked out by the roots, and they go wandering around looking for something. And they find some meaning and some help and something to latch onto in Judaism. And there's nothing stranger than to see a person who you know is not a Jew gawking down an aisle wearing a prayer shawl and a yarmulke on the back of his head, who is a Christian and who has adopted the customs of Judaism. Judaism looks good on Jews. It does not look good on people who aren't Jews. It looks awkward and funny because we don't know how to wear the beanie. We don't know how to wear the prayer shawl. We don't. These are not part of our culture. They're part of theirs. And so there are a lot of people, even in the church today, who are kind of trying to be Jews when they are not. And the teachings of Jesus, I'm sorry, folks, are sharply at variance with the teachings of Judaism. And the people who don't realize that have not really studied the words of Jesus, which is, of course, my current radio program that is running right now on stations across the country. And if you can't hear them, you can get the albums of them from us at CEM if you'd like to hear them. So here was a church in the first century. They were a poor group of people. I think, as we come down to the end time, it's important for us to understand that we have brothers and sisters. They're maybe a little further away from us than a day's walk down the road. But we have brothers and sisters who are in stark, miserable poverty. They are Sabbath-keeping, holiday-keeping Christians. And some of them are in the Ukraine, some of them are in the Eastern Soviet republics. And I think the work that Victor Kubik and a group that are helping him on that to go and help those people is really worthwhile. And I certainly encourage everybody who can and wants to participate to help them out, because they do a good humanitarian work. And those are the kinds of things. Jesus talks about, giving food to the hungry and clothing to the people who don't have clothes to wear, visiting people who are in jail. And again, another place that says, do good to all men, especially to those of the household of faith. And if there are Christians somewhere who are hungry, we ought to be doing something about that. Well, I congratulate Victor Kubik and his group, because they are doing something about that. And here you have, in the modern world, way over there, a church that is in stark, miserable poverty. And one wonders if God doesn't look at those people and say, but you're rich and spiritual wealth. Which is probably why God said it's really tough for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. We really are. On a world scale, we as a people are stinking rich. We are richer than we have any idea that we are. We don't even imagine the things that have come our way. And because we have so much, we tend to love less. And I think that this little lesson out of this church back here, this is a part, when you ask me what is ahead and what lies ahead and what is about the church in the end time, I find in these two churches I've read to you so far a startling little idea of what the church might be like at the end time. That part of the church over here will have lost its first love. Part of the church over here will be incredibly poor, and have to be dealing with some kind of a Jewish problem that's confusing the issue in their area. What else are there out there that the church might be having to deal with? Well, there's Pergamos in verse 12. The angel of the church in Pergamos write, "These things saith he that has the sharp sword with two edges. I know your works. I know you dwell where Satan's seat is. I know you hold fast my name, and you have not denied my faith, even in those days when Antipas, my faithful martyr, who was among you, was slain, where Satan's seat dwells." Now, what's the thing about it is, it does tend to work that way. There tends to be an inverse correlation between physical wealth and spiritual wealth, which is probably why God said it's really tough for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think that a lot of us here who don't think we're well-to-do, we really are. On a world scale, we as a people are stinking rich. We are richer than we have any idea that we are. We don't even imagine the things that have come our way. And because we have so much, we tend to love less. And I think that this little lesson out of this church back here, this is a part, when you ask me what is ahead and what lies ahead and what is about the church in the end time, I find in these two churches I've read to you so far a startling little idea of what the church might be like at the end time. That part of the church over here will have lost its first love. Part of the church over here will be incredibly poor, and will have to be dealing with some kind of a Jewish problem that's confusing the issue in their area. What else are there out there that the church might be having to deal with? Well, there's Pergamos in verse 12. The angel of the church in Pergamos write, "These things saith he that has the sharp sword with two edges. I know your works. I know you dwell where Satan's seat is. I know you hold fast my name, and you have not denied my faith, even in those days when Antipas, my faithful martyr who was among you, was slain, where Satan's seat dwells. Now, what you have to do if you're going to adopt the church era's theory, you have to, what's the word I'm looking for? Create a metaphor out of Antipas. Antipas cannot be a real person. Antipas has to be, the word has to mean something, and there's somebody later in time that will fit that. And you take away, in a way, this poor guy Antipas, who was a member of the church in Pergamos, in Asia Minor, while John was alive, and who died for the faith who was there. You have to almost take away from this man his martyrdom in order to hold to that theory, because what he is saying here is, here was a guy, my faithful martyr, who was slain among you where Satan dwells. Now, I have a few things against you folks, because you have there them that hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit fornication. Now, when you look at this, it's astonishing, and it's very, very hard to grapple with this in a modern sense. But don't try to grapple with it yet in a modern sense. Understand it first historically. Historically, you had on the ground in this particular church people who had followed in the path that Balaam had followed in teaching people to eat things sacrificed to idol and to commit fornication. It's okay. How did that work? Well, you need to understand that in the world at that time, in virtually all these cities, there was a temple of Aphrodite. And an important part of the worship of Aphrodite was fornication. You went up to the temple and you had sex with a temple prostitute. Now, there's a religion. People got into that. And just like today, in our society, it is tempting for us to make all kinds of accommodations to the customs of our society in relation to all the moral ills that go on in our society. Well, they managed to accommodate somehow fornication. Well, I think there's to a degree in the modern world, while we certainly would never teach as a doctrine of the church fornication, we have become, in our own hearts and minds, rather accommodating to the idea of fornication and sodomy and a few other things that we could name, right? To the place to where we don't really think it's that big a deal. And lying about sex and lying about sex, not that big a deal. When people have sex, with somebody not their wife, they're going to lie about it. What's the big deal? Well, here's a church that had come to the place where it was not a big deal. What's amazing is that their candlestick is still in place. When you think about it, look, you realize how different these churches are? Can you imagine historically? Think about these churches historically. No more than a day's walk, maybe 2 days' walk away from each other, and people were used to walking back then. They got down the road. They went places when the time came to go. They were in touch with one another. Can you imagine these churches being under one central authority? How would that be possible? How could that be? If you've got one person telling them precisely what to do in every case, they should be allowing fornication in all 3 churches, all 7 of them. They're not. The doctrine of Balaam should be there in all those churches. It wasn't. The Nicolaitans, should be hated everywhere. They weren't. And so on it goes. These churches were separately administered, or they wouldn't be as different as they are. You just cannot get away from that. Which suggests to me, as we come down to the very end time, you will find churches of God separately administered right down the road from one another. Now, maybe they could do better than they are. These people could do better. Maybe they would do well to be cooperating with one another better than they are. We can throw all kinds of maybes around, and I'll accept all your maybes. But we've got to come back to what we know historically about the church. Historically, they were really not a monolithic church. They were really not centrally governed. And so consequently, when you look at what we might expect to see in the church in the end time, we do not expect to see a church that is centrally governed. We expect to see them right down the road from one another, as different as daylight and dark. And still the church of God. He said, repent, or I'll come unto you quickly, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. I forget which one of it was in here, and my eye doesn't really follow on it at the moment. It says, when I do this to you, all the churches will see and fear and know. Even the ones that are already long gone and dead. That's what you're up against. See, if it's the middle church and all this, and he says, I'll do this to you, and all the churches will hear and fear and know, But if you believe in church eras, the Ephesian era is dead and gone and not capable of learning anything. But historically, there were 7 churches right there. They all were going to hear, they were all going to fear, and they were all going to know. Now, time is getting away from me, so I don't necessarily have to take time to go through every single one of these churches, but I want to take you to the last one. The church at Laodicea. He says, to the angel of the church of Laodicea, this is 3:14, write this. These things saith the Amen, the faithful and true witness, the beginning of the creation of God. I know your works, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were. I really wish you were one way or the other so I could deal with it. But he said, because you are lukewarm and neither cold nor hot, I will spit you out. I feel, frankly, that the defining spirit of this age in which we are living right now is also the defining spirit of the church right now, and it is apathy. Now, some people will jump right up and say, aha, see, this is the last church, this is the end time, apathy, that really we are the Laodicean church. Oh, no. Not everybody. Not everybody. I know people who are not. I know churches that are not. But I do say this, that across the country, the defining spirit of the Church of God is apathy. I'll tell you who is not apathetic. The churches in the Ukraine, the churches in the Eastern Bloc, the churches in China. When you go to places like the Philippines and other places where the Church of God may be found, the church in Burma, these people are not apathetic. They go in fear of their lives. They have to stay close to God. If they don't stay close to God, well, they're not going to make it. They're not going to stay in the faith at all. They'll have to give it up if they don't have the power of God's Spirit to give them the strength to resist. And the truth is, Christianity flourishes in the face of persecution and tends to fade and die in the face of prosperity. That was Israel's problem all the way through their history. They drew close to God in adversity, and they forsook God in prosperity. And here we are at the time of the greatest prosperity in the history of this country. And the country is apathetic, and so is the church. What do you do about that? You see, I can look back and I can see this pattern in the history, and then I can say to myself that the reason why He gave us this, and the reason He said, he who has an ear to hear. You can check. I got 2 left. Let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. These words, I think, are to provide a pattern for us of what we will face and we will look at and the challenges that will come our way at the very end time. And I'll tell you, right now, probably the biggest challenge facing us in the Church of God is apathy. What are we going to do about it? Well, it's tough. It's really tough. I have for a long time, I've been thinking about this, and I find it very difficult to put the sermon together on apathy because somehow, some way, you have got to touch the mind and the heart of the person who has grown lukewarm, and it's a hard thing to do. I am frankly not sure that a sermon can do it. I am not sure about what it may take, a crushing defeat in your life, a terrible setback in your life, something really goes so bad that you have to seek God, for you have nowhere else to go. It may take that. But let me at least give you one little chill of fear. What Jesus said about the church and the people in the church who were apathetic was, I'd rather you were cold. But because you are lukewarm, I am going to spit you out. Whatever that means. I don't like the sound of it. Therefore, I need to find some way, somehow, in my life, some way to stir myself up, some way to find some fire, some way to find a way of getting myself moving. Because if I don't, I am told that He will spit me out. And we don't have to really be told that we are apathetic. We know it. He said, because you are lukewarm, neither cold nor hot, I'll spit you out of your mouth. Because you say, I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing. Just the converse of the earlier church that says, you people are so poverty-stricken, but you're rich. He says to these, you think you're rich, and you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. What this says to me is, That I can have a spiritual condition that is wretched. I can be spiritually miserable. I can be spiritually poor. I can be spiritually blind. And I can be spiritually naked. He said, I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fire. What he seems to be saying at this point is, the only way that I'm going to be able to warm you up is with fire. And fire universally in the Bible is a sign of tribulation and trouble. I counsel you to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that you're going to have to do this. And when we do it, and when we hit it, you'd better be prepared to pull up your socks, to draw close to God, because when the trial comes, you will go one way or the other. And it's not guaranteed that you're going to go the right way. He said, buy of me gold tried in the fire, that you may be spiritually rich, and white raiment, that you may be spiritually clothed. And white raiment, by the way, is the righteousness of the saints. That the shame of your nakedness do not appear, and anoint your eyes with eye salve so you can really see. As many as I love, I rebuke, and I chasten. Be zealous, therefore, and repent. Now, a question I have often been asked over the years is, when adversity strikes, how do you know if it's the chastening of God or if it's just bad luck? Or if it's just time and chance happens to all men? My advice to people is to treat it all the same. You cannot go far wrong if you always treat adversity as chastisement from God. What do you do? If you thought God was chastising you, what would you do? Well, you'd go to your knees, and you would ask for forgiveness, and you would ask Him to help you understand where your mistake was, to help you put your feet on the right path, to help you be obedient to Him, that you want God to put you back in the right way so that you'll walk as a son and really walk with Him. Do you think you have anything at all to lose by treating every adversity the same way that you would treat chastisement from God? Prayer, a repentant spirit and a repentant attitude, asking for guidance and direction from God, asking Him to help you to put your feet in the right way, telling Him you are certainly sorry for anything in your life that's there that should not be, and asking Him to show you the way to put your feet right. You know, when a person comes to God with a meek and a contrite spirit and says, Lord, where have I gone wrong? And how can I put my feet right? God loves to see that kind of spirit in people. And that is where things start to change. I can tell you this. I don't think there is any way that we can avoid from our present condition some serious chastisement from God, which may in some ways have already begun. It may be begun as individuals, but I think it also may come upon us and may have already come upon us as a church. You treat that chastisement by going to your knees, begging forgiveness, repenting of your sins, asking God to show you the sins that you can't see, being sorry for the sins you may have done that you're not even sure what they are. A broken and a contrite spirit, O God, you will not despise. He then goes on to say, having said, be zealous therefore and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. This is not really that hard. I'm standing at the door over here, and I'm knocking. If any man will hear my voice and open the door, I will come in and sup with him, and he with me. We'll sit down and we'll eat together. We'll have supper together, and we'll talk. The first step along the way, I think, in overcoming sin, is conviction of sin. The second step is confession of sin. And when you are convicted, and when you confess, and when you go to God and ask for forgiveness and to ask for help, this is called opening the door. And it's really not hard. It's really not. How hard is it to go to a private place and get on your knees? How hard is it to tell God, I've been wrong? How hard is it to confess to God, the things that you have done, the mistakes that you have made, the ways in which you want to put your life right? How hard is it? Behold, I stand at the door and knock. The challenge for us is to get up off our backside and go open the door. And that may be a bigger challenge, frankly, than some of us have faced in a while. To invite God into our life, to invite Him to dominate our life, to direct our life, that's what all of us really want. The problem we have is that over time, because we have had our pride, because we have had our desire to be self-important, important even as a church, because we have thought more highly of ourselves than we ought to have thought, because we have prospered in the world and have done rather well for ourselves, and we have tended to forget God. And our brothers in different parts of the world are suffering, while some of them are going hungry, while you and I are having all in the world to eat our hearts could desire, and more than we ought to. They are actually in prison when you and I are free to go and come as whatever we want. They live in fear of their lives whenever we have a government that protects our rights to free speech and to say, for me to get up here and say the things that I might even say to criticize the leadership of our country. They cannot come and they cannot touch me for doing these things. We have brothers around the world who can't do those things. One of the ways that might help us with our apathy is if we were more in direct touch with our poor brethren, our persecuted brethren, our struggling brethren, and those people who right now are going through things that maybe in years to come, in order to finally overcome our own lethargy, God may allow to come upon us. If that's what it takes, so be it, Lord Jesus, for we are in your hand to do as you see fit.